In the previous example, we had our routing switch to a state which was configured with a controller. Inside of that controller, as part of the very first action in the $ on init function, we reached out to an asynchronous service to retrieve the data we needed for that controller to function. There's some disagreement in the community if this sequence of events is backwards or not. Some say it would be definitely better if part of the transition to the next view, the next state, we first retrieve the data needed and then simply pass that data to the controller. Well, with the state's resolve property, we could do just that and more. Let's take a look at the syntax. You could see that here we're declaring a state by the name of view1. You can also see that we're declaring that state with the controller view1 controller as view1. But now we have a new property called resolve. Resolve is a configuration object that has some key and value pairs. The key myData has something that we haven't really seen since the very beginning of the course, and that's because we've been using a much more elegant injection that I'm using here in this example. But all we're doing here is protecting our function that gets the service injected into it with some minification protection. So if you remember from the very first lectures that we had, if you provide an array with a bunch of strings, the last value of which is a function, those strings in the order that they are declared are going to be considered the items that you want to inject into that last value, the function value, and its arguments will match up to the declared injection artifacts that were listed in the same array. So here we have an array with the first value, which is the string service, and the last value, or the second value, is a function value that takes a service as an argument, which means AngularJS will inject the service into that function. Note that service.getData returns a promise. At the end of this, myData is going to have a value which is going to be injected into the view1 controller with a key of myData, which means just like we inject a controller with a service called myService, for example, we will be able to inject our view1 controller with yet another artifact by the name of myData, which matches exactly the key inside the resolve object. Now, if the resolve property, in this case myData, gets assigned a promise, which is also the case in this example, the router will not advance us to the new state, in this case view1, until the promise is resolved. If the promise gets rejected altogether, the router will not advance us to the new state at all. Inside of our controller, the view1 controller, we inject myData just like we would inject anything else that needs to be injected into our controller. We protect it from minification by declaring it on the $inject array and then simply list it in the same order as one of the arguments to the function view1 controller. The resolve properties don't have to be promises. They can actually be anything we want to inject into the corresponding controller, even a string, as this example shows. Okay, let's jump back into the code editor and rewrite our previous example using this resolve property.